On this episode of Narcissist Apocalypse, we talk with an abuse survivor named Andrea. And Andrea was raised in a sexually, physically, and emotionally abusive household. It's a story of parentification, hypervigilance, isolation, guilt, shame, collapse, and healing. Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and with me today we have Andrea. How are you?
I'm great, Brandon, and thank you so much for having me this morning.
Well, thank you for being here, and if you want to be a guest like Andrea is today, go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com, click on the guest form button at the top of the page, and we will go from there. We are looking for more mother-daughter stories as well, as we're doing a little project that has to do with mother-daughter stories. We're going to be starting with mother-daughter stories and creating frameworks for everything. So send those in. And also, we have a newsletter. And in our newsletter, you get a free workbook from this episode and all future episodes. People find our newsletter helpful, our workbooks helpful. So if you want to join our newsletter, everything is free. Go to narcissistapocalypse.com as well. And also, it really helps out the show if you are a listener and haven't subscribed to our show to subscribe to the show, as well as leave us a nice review. It will always be helpful to us if you do that. And we do have a content warning for today's episode as we do discuss childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, sexual assault, and suicidal ideation in this episode. And it is not just once or twice that you're going to hear this stuff, it's going to be discussed throughout the episode. So that is your content warning for today. And today you're going to hear Andrea's story, and Andrea's life changed when she was 4.5 years old, and that's when she was sexually abused by her dad. But this story isn't just about that. Her mom had a chance to protect her, but her mom chose to stay silent, and for a brief time was physically abusive as well. And there's lots of other stuff that came along with this. The parentification did occur here, and you'll soon hear it all, but it really creates a real divide, and safety for Andrea came in all different forms, and she was alone with figuring out how to protect herself, which should not be a child's role at all. And for those of you who only really listen to relationship stories, mostly you'll find some parallels within the story as well to validate what you've gone through as well. So a big thank you to Andrea for being here with us today. And now I'm going to get it my way in your way. Andrea, the floor is now yours.
Wow, good morning. So, the story that I'm going to tell you, I think I can take you back a little bit in time. My story is about surviving my father's molestation and to some extent my mother's willful blindness. So, a little bit of background on where my parents' childhood. My dad was the oldest son of a New York City police officer, and my grandmother had grown up, as I hear, she had had a terrible birthmark from birth, and she was the youngest child of 6 boys, so she had almost grown up like a servant to the boys, and, they thought nobody was gonna marry her, and her parents were allegedly mean to her. And so when she had my dad, my understanding is she was very abusive to him. She used to tie him to a tree in the backyard and leave him out there all day, literally feed him out there almost like a puppy until he was about 3 years old. Now, I don't know 100% the veracity of this story, but I do know that even my aunts and uncles who are my mom's sisters and brothers who knew him back then say that his mother was horrible to him, very abusive. My mom grew up, as far as I know, there was really not that many issues. The one thing that I know about my mother she was very pretty, but she also had an eating disorder, anorexia way back then. And her mother, my grandmother, who was not particularly progressive, sent her to a psychiatrist. And in fact, this is one story I know when she went to the psychiatrist, right before she got engaged to my father, they got engaged very young, and they met when my mother was 15 and my father was 18. My mother and her friends actually snuck into a fraternity party that my father was at. And they started dating. They grew up literally blocks from each other. They went to different high schools. They got married when my mom was 18 and my father was I guess he's 4 years older than she was, 3.5 years older, so he was 21 or 22. And then they had me. I was born, and then about 2.5 years later, they had my sister. And when I was very young, my dad was teaching high school and going to graduate school for English literature and to become a college professor, and my mom was a housewife. And I think as far as I know, I had a relatively normal childhood until I was about 4.5. And that's when the abuse began with my father. And at the time, my family was living in a two-bedroom apartment in Queens. My sister was about 2 years old, and as I said, I was 4.5. And that the night that I recall it beginning, my parents were going to go out for a dinner with friends in Manhattan, which my mother rarely got to do. And she asked my father to give me a bath. And I remember being really surprised because my father never took care of me. My father was very traditional, and my mother did all the caretaking. Now, of course, I was so young. I didn't know what was happening. And as it was happening, my mother walked into the bathroom. And things that you remember the sounds. I remember the click of her high heels as she was dressed in her slip, and she screamed. And I watched her, and then she fainted and fell to the floor. My father caught her before her head hit the tile. And I thought we killed her. Watching it, I really thought we killed my mother. And she was out for maybe a minute, and she came to, and when she came to, she was blind. And that night, my father ended up taking her to the hospital. The babysitter came, and that night, I remember my father told me that it was my fault. And that's, the strongest memory I have as a child, and I don't have as much clear before, but what I do remember is having this feeling that something had changed between my parents and our roles in our lives had changed. I went from being a child and to being my mother's protector and the keeper of a shared secret with my father.
So after this occurs, it is very quickly for you. You, as from what you told me, things go downhill. It's hard for a lot of people to comprehend that a child can become depressed or at such a young age that you could have suicidal ideation or things like that at a very young age. It's hard for people to understand, but for you, these things became, part of your everyday, and being on the receiving end of your dad not just abusing you, but then blaming your mom's blindness on you. So all of a sudden, two things have occurred here. One, this terrible thing that happened to you, and then this blame as if you are the cause of these things. So it's a double whammy right here. And no one right here is here to protect you. And all of a sudden, you're thrust into a completely different role. You're no longer a child at this point. So going forth from here, how do things like devolve?
So the abuse would continue until I was almost 13. But as I grew up, I really internalized that feeling of pain. I really believed that I had caused my mother to go blind. Now, my mother did get her sight back in a month, but when my mother got her sight back, she turned away from me, and my father started touching me more, and my mother started hitting me for she didn't continue, but she hit me for about a year and a half. Anything that I did, she would slap me. And even to the point where I remember being almost 5.5 years old and going to a neighbor's funeral. And when I went to the neighbor's funeral, I was so desperate. I wanted my mother to love me again, even more than I still hadn't really figured out what my father was doing and why it was wrong. But I knew that it had caused my mother to go blind and to stop loving me. And I knew that I wasn't allowed to tell. And when I went to this neighbor's funeral, I remember how everybody was so like sad for it was a grandmother of my friend, and I wanted people to be sad for me. I said, "Oh my God, she's so loved." And I wanted to be loved like that too. And so even at the age of 5.5, I didn't really know what death was, but I decided I wanted to die. And I actually after my mother and I had a hitting episode, stuffed my nose with toilet paper and taped up my mouth and stuffed cotton balls in my ears in an effort, my child effort to die. And it was it was so confusing as a little girl. How do you live with this? My father was touching me, and my mother was hitting me. Now, after that, my mother stopped hitting me. She never hit me again for as long as I lived. But my father's abuse continued. And my mother knew what was going on. She could see there were stains in the sheets. There was, there were signs. And I, as a little girl, grew more and more sadder and distracted.
So, your mom goes blind, gets her eyesight back, but at the same time, she remains blind to what is going on. And it's not that she's not choosing to see things, she sees things. She knows what happened, and it's willful blindness that has occurred here. So, can you talk about this willful blindness and how that at a young age affects you at this time? Or did it? Or did you think about it in that way? Or did you say anything? Or was it just kind of left silent?
I think, in my house, a lot was silent, but it did affect me. I mean, I wanted my mother to love me, and I felt unlovable. So I think it did affect me. And as I got older, and started realizing as I went into as I turned about 9 or 10, I read very early, so I was a pretty precocious reader, and I started having an understanding about what was going on with my father. I knew it was wrong, and I thought it was my fault. I thought that had in some ways made myself irresistible to him, and I thought that my mother was angry at me. I wanted her to forgive me. And slowly, even at the age of about 9 or 10, it started I started doing more self-harm. I used to take the little pins and the pins, my mother had a red pin cushion, just like a lot of mothers do. And I would take the pins and I ritualistically would poke myself. So if my mother would be mad at me, I'd do 10 pokes or 20 pokes, and I needed to do the pokes as a way to release the pain.
And also at this time, as we mentioned, you are taking blame for what occurred with your mom. So you're wanting this attention from your mom. You're starving for this attention for your mom to the point where you would want to die. There's self-harm going on. But at the same time, you told me when we talked earlier that you became your mom's parent. So talk to us about this.
My mother did go to school and did some of the the motherly things, but I thought I was responsible for my mother's happiness. I became what we call a parentified child. I thought I was responsible for my mother's happiness. I had a younger sister. I also thought I was responsible for protecting her. I knew what was happening to me. I didn't want it to be happening to her. So I was really good. I tried so hard to be good and to be helpful and, I thought my mother's happiness, I was responsible for how my mother felt. And if my mother felt sad, I thought that was my fault, and I would try to cheer her up. If my mother felt angry, I thought that was my fault, and I would try to, calm her down. I think this is not uncommon. I do a lot of work with children who, I spend a lot of time in a survivor advocate, and what my reaction is not uncommon to what we see in children who have been both physically and sexually abused. And in my case, I think it was a little bit more profound because of the blindness. I mean, there was an actual physical thing that happened, and I was like, oh my God, I caused this. I have to protect her. This is my job.
So today we're hearing your story where sexual abuse is a big part of it. And for a lot of people that come on the show, that might be the focus. But when we spoke, you know, you had already come to the conclusion that the best, or not the best, but the person who affected you or deeply hurt you even deeper than that was your mom.
So I will say, because I don't want my mother, I don't want my father and these men who do the things that my father did to me do not deserve to go scot-free. So my father does not go without blame. He is not, for lack of a better term, he was a monster. It was a monstrous thing that he did to me. Awful. But I think what really hurt me the most, like really, really hurt me, because in the end, my father, you know, uh, I just, there's nothing you could do or feel about this but that he was a monster. But my mother's failure to protect me was the hardest thing. And it almost caused a hole in my soul. And I think part of that was because, somewhere back in time, I remember my mother loving me. I mean, I learned to read really early, and my mother taught me to read. And I know deep inside of myself that at one point I was loved and then I wasn't. And that the taking away of that love and the coldness and the failure, my mother did not protect me. I was grateful that she did protect my sister from the sexual abuse, but she did not protect me. And she didn't protect my father was violent too. And she didn't protect either one of us from the violence. So that was truthfully the bigger pain for me, which isn't to say I don't wanna only blame her, but I do, it hurt me more.
So on the outside, your family looked good to the world, but on the inside, obviously, we know that things were different. And you moved lots, which for your family, and we hear this a lot in abusive relationship stories, this is isolation. Moving protects the secrets so people don't have a long time to ask enough questions where you are or to get to know you. So, talk to us about this part of your childhood.
So, as I talked about, my family from the outside, one of the things that I realize when we look at my family is no one really understood this abuse was happening because the family looked so perfect from the outside. And my father, as I said, became a professor, and he taught at a college, and my mother actually went back to school and started studying. And when I was about 9, my father got arrested for, now, we left Queens when I was 5, and then we moved to a place called Comac, New York. And when my father got his job as a professor, we moved to Oyster Bay. So we'd already moved 3 times. And when I was about 9, my father got arrested for forging his PhD. And he lost his job. We had to move suddenly. My parents didn't move. They actually stayed to sell the house, and my father he was arrested, but he wasn't indicted. So the charges were never formally brought. He went before a grand jury, but they decided not to indict, although the truth was he did forge his PhD. So my parents stayed in where we were living in a town called Oyster Bay, and my sister and I moved in with my grandmother in the Bronx. And I remember at that point thinking my parents were actually giving us away to her, which had both good and bad kind of, there was a mixed thing. They didn't. They came and got us about 4 months later, and we moved to Florida. And when we moved to Florida, my father got a job. I don't know how he did it, given his background, at a community college, and he taught there. And he also started writing books. My dad, he was a hustler. He could always get something. He was writing books, he was doing consulting. So we moved to Florida, and while we were in Florida, I think we moved by the time I was in 8th grade when we left Florida, we had moved 9 times. So my family was always moving, and when I look back on that, I sometimes think of it as wow, we moved because when we didn't even have to move, and I thought this was a way that no one could ever get that close with us. We always stayed in that nuclear family, and I think it was because we had so many secrets that if we stayed anywhere too long, people probably could have figured it out. So, anyway, in that time, the abuse continued. And as a survivor, we all need things to protect ourselves. And I found my books, and I love to read, and I used to read the ends of books before the beginning of books because I was so hyper vigilant that I didn't want to not know the ending of a book and be upset by it or be made sad. So I always liked to know what I was getting myself into. But I read constantly, and I read several years above my grade level. I think by 11 I was reading full on college age books. And so my books were, honestly, as children who have abuse like I did, there has to be someone or something that saves you. For me, it was the books. There really wasn't anyone. Like I said, we moved, no teacher could get close enough to really help us. So for the most part, there was the books. And I then my mother got me a diary when I was about 10. And that diary is when I started writing. I have been a writer my whole life. And when she gave it to me, it was pink, and it had a little gold chain and a little gold lock. And she gave me a little gold pen that matched it. And it was all so beautiful. And she told me I could write my secrets in that. And of course, I wasn't going to write my secrets in a diary. I had no beauty. The diary was beautiful, and my secrets were horrible. So I started writing in the diary. I made up a girl named Emily, and I started writing in the diary about this girl named Emily. She was like beautiful. She sang in chorus. She had lots of friends. She had everything that I didn't. She had like loving parents. And so my Emily stories were, that's what saved me. I had this little life on the side, Emily and her family. And I think I filled 2 diaries and moved on to the composition books eventually. But I remember my sister once found my diary, and she was so disappointed that there were no secrets in it. But I made up a sister named Amy after the sister Amy in Little Women. So that's how I survived. I mean, everybody needs something. I as bad as things were, and they were very bad, because my father at that point was pretty much coming to my room at least weekly, if not a couple times a week. And as I said, my mother, although she didn't hit me anymore, she wasn't really the loving mother that we all want. And so having the books saved me. And having my sister, I love my sister. I was grateful that this did not happen to her. So time went on, and when I was about 11 years old, I started having nightmares. My father took me to a store to buy started he would give me things. Like when I was 6, he gave me a bicycle after the one of the times he abused me. He would buy me little presents, but he never took me shopping. And he came after one of the sessions, and my mother and my sister were out, and I was alone in the house, and he knocked on my door, and he was dressed, and he took me to the store, and he took me to the preteen department and shopping, and he bought me a dress. And at the time, he was telling me, "Oh, you're beautiful, like Sophia Loren is beautiful." For those who are too young to remember Sophia Loren, she was an Italian actress who was very well known for being sexy. I looked nothing like Sophia Loren. I mean, I had dark hair and dark eyes and olive skin, but beyond that, no Sophia Loren. And but he took me and after he took me shopping, I started having horrible nightmares and sleepwalking. I think it was a reaction to everything. I just, I started breaking down. And at that time, I would wake the family every night screaming. So at that time, my parents decided, and I still don't know. It's crazy because even for my parents, this was a crazy decision, and I'll never know why, but they decided I should go see a psychiatrist. And at the time, I was reading the book Jane Eyre, and in Jane Eyre, Jane is a nanny to children, and there's a man who's actually blind. I just thought of that, named Mr. Rochester, the father of the children. And there's a lady in the attic, and the lady in the attic is Mr. Rochester's wife. Mr. Rochester's wife was the mad woman in the attic, and I was so scared because my father was, but by that time, threatening to put me away. And so I thought, "Oh God, I'll end up like the mad woman in the attic." So my parents decided to send me to the psychiatrist. Part of me thinks it was my father's kind of Machiavellian way to set up the record, as it were, for if I ever told, then he could say, "Look how crazy this child is. Look how hysterical she is." And the other part of me, the part of me that wants to believe in good, and I am a person who really wants to believe in good, thinks, "Oh, well, maybe it was my mother's idea, and maybe it was her way of protecting me." But going to that psychiatrist kind of began the beginning of changing everything. And ultimately, one day my father tried to kiss me, and I just had enough. I was just about to turn 13. I was seeing the psychiatrist, and I decided I was going to tell him a little bit of information, but not everything. Now, for those listeners who are going to, know about mandated reporting, this was in 1968. That was not something we had. And I told the psychiatrist a little bit and not enough. And he pulled my parents in and met with them. And after that, my father never touched me again. He stopped. Now, I don't know, what my father said to me was that the psychiatrist told him I had an abnormal fixation with my father, but I don't know. But he didn't touch me again after that. He did leave me a book on my bed as a gift called The Scarlet Letter. And for those listeners who might not didn't read The Scarlet Letter in high school or middle school, The Scarlet Letter is a book written in the 1800s by by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and it's about this young woman in the 1600s who has an affair with a pastor, and they get discovered. And at the end of the affair, the pastor goes off scot-free, stays a pastor, and the young woman is, put on a scaffold and mocked by her friends and family, and is forced to wear a scarlet A on her chest for the rest of her life. And that's what I thought. I thought, okay, I knew that was his final message to me. If I ever tell, there will be consequences. So I never told.
So the abuse stops here. However, the trauma is still with you at this age, and the coping mechanisms are still with you. Your survival skills are still with you. And my assumption is you are a very hyper vigilant person at this very young age, reading rooms, reading temperatures, knowing what people are up to, knowing who's in a good mood, who's in a bad mood. You're able to read everything is my biggest assumption. But what else could be going on with you besides that? Are you a people pleaser? What are some survival skills you have learned that maybe hinder you later in life? And what are some other coping mechanisms that were created that might not be good for you?
Well, so I cut. I was a cutter. I had graduated by that point from pins to knives, to scissors and knives. So I cut my body. I was hypervigilant and I was really good at school. So there were the good survival things and the bad ones. So the cutting is in the self-destructive. And I was really good at school. That was in the good category, but almost to the point of I was terrified not to be perfect. But on the other side, I was hypervigilant except for with boys. I ended up in a couple situations where boys, and then later I went to a party with somebody that ended up not being a party where I was assaulted by 3 boys. So, it's the strangest thing because I was vigilant, and yet sometimes I didn't know where danger ended and safety began. And then when things would happen to me with boys, I would freeze, and so those were some of the bad things, I suppose. I don't blame myself for the assaults, by the way. But later, I kind of changed that and started realizing with just a tiny bit of alcohol and a tiny bit of marijuana, I could relax enough and have sex. And I started using sex as a way to control people instead, like control men, control boys. I didn't take pleasure, but I kind of liked that I had control over them at that very moment. It was a little bit not healthy at all. I really didn't have the ability for intimacy. I had a hard time. I think it was almost as if my intimacy muscle was I could be in relationships for, even a year, but I would always leave if people got too close. Even friendships. I had a hard time with intimacy of any kind. So those were the negative coping mechanisms. There was a big part of me, though, I refused to talk about this abuse, to think about this abuse. I convinced myself, much like my mother, keep in mind, I had a mother who was both physically blind and willfully blind, that if I was smart enough, pretty enough, perfect enough, I could continue my life and pretend the abuse didn't happen and that it would just go away. And as you pointed out, the actual molestation, the abuse can continue, but the trauma lives with us. It lives in our body. It just doesn't go away. It stays with us. And, I had a couple points when I graduated from college. I had a lot of suicidal ideation from time to time. And then I would wrap it up and put it in a box and put it away and keep going and go, okay. I mean, I did succeed. I first became a nurse. Then I later went to law school. I did had a successful life until one day I didn't.
So you're dealing with shame, guilt, perfectionism, as you're hard on yourself. You're trying to avoid the trauma that caused these things, and you're doing your best to compartmentalize these things, put them in boxes after they come up, and ideation happens, and it helps you move past these things, not through these things. These boxes are piling up. But before we discuss when those compartmentalized boxes grow too big for the closet that you're stuffing them in, which happens in your 30s, you still have a relationship with your mother. And this is a solid 10-year period in between that time. So take us through this time. Tell us what happened.
I had a relationship with her. I talked to her. I was really bent on pretending my family was normal. So I had a relationship with her. I was gone, so I didn't live at home. I went to college, then I lived other places. So my relationship with my parents was I would see them for lunch. Sometimes I lived in New York City and they would come in and we'd go to lunch and we'd hug and say goodbye. When I graduated from law school, they came to my graduation. It wasn't close in the way that some mother-daughter relationships were, but at the same time it was. I talked to her. I actually was always trying to make it right. So, I was always trying to be close and make it right. I spent a lifetime trying to make it right.
And during that period, you brought up your sister earlier. Your sister technically is the only person you can really talk to about this stuff during this period. So, are you guys talking about that during this time, or are you just trying to live your life at this time and, you know, just go along until you break?
My sister and I are so close, and I talk to her about everything, but I never talked to her about that. In fact, she didn't know the extent of it until much later. And my sister and I hung out, and we were 3 years apart. So we were, in fact, young women in New York City together, and we did things together, but we didn't talk about that. So I never told anybody. I just kept it to, I kept it locked in a box. I didn't tell my friends in college. I did not talk to anybody about it. I just kept going.
And then one day you broke. So, tell us about what happened for the breaking to occur.
Well, so I was actually living with this guy and I was 33. I had been a lawyer, a nurse and then a lawyer, so I hadn't been a lawyer very long. And I was on a New York City subway and I was coming home from a deposition, I believe it was, or no, mediation. And actually the train went dark it's the New York City subways, they're not perfect. And for the train jolted to a stop, and it was a unseasonably hot day, and I had taken my jacket off, and I was wearing this camisole top, and the train jolted to a stop, and it went dark just for a couple minutes, and somebody grabbed my breast. They groped me, and I and then the lights came on, and I remember looking at everybody in the subway going, "Who did that?" And I thought I screamed, but nobody reacted, so I guess my voice was frozen because everybody, went back to normal, and I tried to go back to normal, and I couldn't. It was kind of I no longer could remember how to forget. I had taught myself so well how to forget, and I couldn't do it anymore. I started having flashbacks. I started having suicidal ideation again. I started thinking about jumping off bridges, jumping off buildings. I had stopped cutting in college, and I had trained myself. It was like breaking an addiction. And I started to cut again, and I was having panic attacks. I had a really bad panic attack and ended up in the hospital, and they gave me the name of a therapist. And I decided, I really kind of realized that I was gonna die if I didn't get help. And I went to a therapist, and I was there. And ultimately, I spent 12 days in an inpatient facility. And I won't get into the details of why or how it happened, but in that inpatient facility, I finally I told everyone in the group what happened. And it was like a light went off for me. And I finally started to get the help that I needed to get. Which is kind of my message to other people and other survivors is you can heal, but you have to get help. And I finally said, I can't keep pretending because I realized that I thought that if I kept everything a secret, and this was my survival strategy, that I could pretend it didn't happen and I was going to live my best life, that I wouldn't be a victim, that I would just go on and I wouldn't live this victim life, that this was resilience, that I was going to be resilient. And I really thought this. I thought that, okay, just keep succeeding, keep moving forward. And what I realized is that my secret was actually the thing that was going to kill me. Keeping this secret was the thing. The trauma had stopped, but instead of helping myself, I was making it worse. And I just needed to get that help, which was years of therapy. I talked to a lot of therapists, and one of the issues, of course, was what kind of relationship do I want with my parents? I mean, that's a big, big issue. I'm a survivor of sexual abuse perpetrated by my father. My mother did not protect me. Do I want to end my relationship with them? And my mother stayed with my father. So all this time, and she had her own, trauma from him. I don't know about any other pedophilia, but I do know that he cheated on her with adult women. He had a woman on the side for a really long time. And, she had her own trauma from him, but she stayed with him. She was not going to leave him under any circumstance. So I knew that, I had to really look at it and say, do I want to cut my relationship with both of them or do I want to continue? And I I just could not leave my mother. And a lot of therapists, some, not all, told me that might not have been the healthier decision. But I could not leave my mother. I just didn't want to. And so I knew that keeping my mother in my life meant keeping my father in my life. And, so I did. It was very hard because I was in therapy, of course, and I was talking about this. And I wasn't talking about it as much as I am today. And we can talk a little bit about how I got to that point. But I was telling my therapist, and when I met my husband, who my intimacy muscle that was severed did ultimately heal, and I've been able to have a 25-year marriage. That's a good marriage. So that was the gift of therapy. But I kept my relationship with them, even and with my mother particularly. But with my father, it was never close. It was never close. And when he died in 2017, I honestly felt only relief. And actually, though, his death freed me a little bit to begin telling my story on a more public basis. And, I wrote a book called Such a Pretty Picture that was published this year about surviving this. And I think it was the confluence of his death and the Me Too movement made me realize that other people could benefit from my story and from the fact that, again, healing is possible, but you have to tell. But I kept my mother in my life, and my mother, she finally apologized to me and told me she was sorry for everything that happened, but that was 2 weeks before her death. And, one of the things that I realized is that even though by that point I'd had decades of therapy, I mean, on and off, of course, but not all the time. But I didn't realize, I still, on this little tiny bit inside of me, I think it was just so ingrained from my young, young age. I still blame myself a little bit for her blindness, for her pain. And when she started to talk to me, I wanted to stop her, strangely enough, to protect her. She was old and frail. And I didn't, and I let her tell me she was sorry, and I think, her apology to me allowed me ultimately, I would forgive her, and I also forgave myself. I realized completely and honestly, and these incest is so complicated, that none of this was my fault. None of it was, and never would be, and so I'm free.
And when your mom passed away, we hear from a lot of survivors of all different types of abuse, that when it came to someone who was abusive in their life, that they had a, even if they didn't speak to that parent anymore, that they had another round of grief and sadness, not because their parent passed away per se, but because there was this dream still alive in them, that as long as that their parent was alive, that there might have been a possibility that they could have the relationship that they always did want from that parent. So for you, did you have that, or did you have like a closure in a way right there within that last 2 weeks?
I think it's complicated. I mean, it's just I wish it was, like, perfectly closed. I did have some self-forgiveness, but in the time when my mom was sick, the lot after my father died, I had already started writing the book that I would ultimately publish, so I was struggling a little bit with the fact that I was betraying my the book actually got accepted for publication right after my a year after my mother died, and I struggled a little bit with I struggled a lot with the idea that I was betraying her on some level. And so, yes and no, that I grieved for both my parents in that way. I mean, for my father, sometimes I'll still like I feel sorry for him that I'm not angry at him anymore, but that he robbed himself and robbed me of the opportunity to have a normal father-daughter relationship. I feel really sorry for him for that. For my mother, yeah, I mean, it makes me sad that things could never have been different. But I think I have some closure on that. I feel sad, and I think the hardest part, honestly, has been when I wrote my book that I had been protecting her for so long, and here I was, like, writing this story about her and my father, and especially about her not protecting me, and the response that people got. I mean, when you read reviews of a book or you read reviews of interviews and people are so angry at her, I had some moments like that where I grieved and felt really sad for that. I felt a little bit of betrayal, but my sister's been really helpful that way because she quickly reminds me whenever I feel that way that my mother didn't protect me. And to some extent, although she protected her against sexual abuse, she didn't protect her against the other abuse. And that I don't owe my mother anything at this point. So it's complicated, right? I wish it was simple and there would be one final closure, but I think that there isn't. But, what I can say is there's joy that you get to have in your life, and I don't think I had any joy for a really long time.
And after your mom passed away, things that you told me in our pre-call, as far as things that you were using as either coping mechanisms or survival strategies, I had down here that you were a people pleaser. I had down here that you would get upset if people didn't like you. And, staying in school was a big thing for you. That part of control was done through the school aspect of things in achieving. So, where you are now, do you still have some of these coping mechanisms that are going on in your life that have hindered you? Are you in school again for anything? And so, like, how are you dealing with those things? Because those things are admirable types of things. The people pleasing can get you in trouble. You getting upset if people don't like you is something that you might want to yourself be working on. Are there other things that you're working on that involve these coping mechanisms to, you know, just allow yourself to be who you are, be loved, love yourself, and be okay with just sitting on the couch and doing nothing, and you don't have to, achieve to be worthy and things along those lines.
when I was writing my book, I decided to go back in therapy because I was excavating all of these memories. I mean, all of them. So I'm still in therapy, and I can say that I can have a whole day and just take a nap and listen to podcasts or read for pleasure and not do anything, which is really good. I I'm not in school. I think I'm good on the school front. I had told you that, when I was 50, I got an MFA. So I have a law degree, a nursing degree, an MFA. I think I'm good on the school front. I don't need any more school. And although, I laughed because I started practicing yoga and I ended up practicing more. And I ended up doing the yoga teachers training, which is a little bit me, another degree, another certificate. But in reality, I didn't really do that for that great achievement as much as to learn more. And I think right now I can just learn for learning's sake. As far as people pleasing goes, I'm old and I don't have that much time, so I've really kind of let go of that. And when you write a book, you better get used to people not being pleased because some reviews are really good and some people just don't like it. So my reviews I'm going to caveat that, been really good for the most part, but you set yourself out there. And so I think you have to get over that. And, or I did. I do work on it still. I am a lifelong project, as most of us are, but I can sit. I can just sit. I can sit in the corner of the couch and even watch a stupid TV show, like a reality TV show, and just be mindless. And I don't need any more approval.
And if you had any words of wisdom for everyone listening, what would they be?
Again, I think they're the same words. It's like, for those people who are surviving any kind of childhood sexual abuse or any sexual abuse or just any abuse in general, you can heal. If I healed, you can heal, but you have to get help. You must get help, please. Get help, find a therapist, find someone to talk to and get the help that you need. And for anybody who have been abused the way that I was or otherwise, it's not your fault. Remember that. You didn't do anything. A crime was perpetrated against you. And my last piece of advice for those people who are the relatives and friends of survivors, be kind, believe them, support them, and be kind.
Well, Andrea, I really want to thank you for being here with me today, sharing your story, and giving hope and strength to a lot of people today, and also giving people validation for what they went through. And I'm going to put all of your information in the show notes where people can buy your book. And I really can't thank you enough for being here with us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It was a fun conversation. So,
Well, thank you, Andrea, once again for being our guest today. And all of Andrea's information will be in our show notes if you want to get her book. And if you want to be a guest like Andrea was today, please do go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com. You'll see the guest form button at the top of the page. Just click on that button, fill out the form, submit the form, or send us an email at narcissistapocalypse@pm.me. Also, we have a newsletter at our website, so if you want to join our newsletter where you'll get a free workbook for this episode, reflections, exercises, everything is free. Join our newsletter at narcissistapocalypse.com. And that is it for today's survivor story, for today's episode. So for myself and Andrea, we hope you have a good night.